Now that my original 12 to 15 shapes are completely dry, I'm going to start experimenting with how those shapes can now fit together to start to make more complex shapes or start to build a form. So you can experiment with lots of different ways. I sort of like how that one has 3 triangles within it. I could maybe try experimenting with several different ways. Maybe they stack together along that long edge right there. They sort of fit nicely that way. Maybe I can make them rotate where they spin and start to make a little spiral. I don't know, that's a couple of examples. I can experiment with what happens if I stack 3 of those together and make them rotate out. That could be really interesting and be the start of a weird, fun way of combining those shapes together. But with your shape today, I want you to just experiment, play around, figure out how they work together. There's never going to be just one right answer with this project. You could really go in a lot of different directions. So I've got 4 different options right there for my particular shape. And once you've experimented with those, you're going to try to glue them together and see how they work once they're in a larger section of those shapes. So I'm going to grab my glue and start with just these few samples and play around with seeing how they attach, how those toothpicks kind of intertwine together and where they link. I'm trying, of course, to find a way to make sure that it's really secure. I want to make sure that I'm gluing those together where they touch at least 2 points, because that's going to help ensure that it's going to be a structurally sound sculpture. So I will try that and see how they fit together and let those set up completely to dry. Now for the next 2 ideas, I want to be able to lay those toothpicks together where they're attached along that single toothpick along the edge of it, but I also want to be able to prop them up so that way they're kind of spaced and become more 3-dimensional. So I'm going to take just some scrap sheets of paper and roll that up into like a little segment that's going to act as a spacer for me to prop those toothpicks up while they're drying. And those are great because they can be really beneficial and you don't have to hold it, and it's going to let it dry without being disturbed. And then you can reuse those over and over again if you decide that that method works for you and your project. So there I am. I'm just going to try to wedge that in between to hold those toothpicks apart so they don't fall flat, and see if I can get those to fit together. So that seemed to work pretty well as a spacer to prop those toothpicks up. I think that will be successful. And now I'm going to try it with my section of 3 shapes with 2 spacers in between them so I can rotate those 3 out, and I'll see how that goes. So I'm seeing now how to add that 3rd shape to this section. While the first 2 are still wet, may make this a little bit tricky, and I'm not sure if this is going to work great. I may need to glue them together in pairs and then glue the pairs together rather than trying to do 3 at one time, just start with 2. So I'm going to experiment a little bit more. I think it may help me if I tape those little rolls of spacers with paper together just to make them more consistent and a little bit more durable. And then just see how this works, and I can reuse those spacers as the sections dry and then reuse them with other ones. But it does seem to be a lot more troublesome to try to do multiple shapes at once rather than just 2 at a time. So it takes a little bit of problem solving, a little bit of careful layering and stacking, and then I'm just going to let those dry completely. Now, if I like the experimentation that I've done and I think this shape is going to work well for my sculpture, I'm going to start building as many of those little basic shapes as I can out of my 3 toothpicks. So I'm just going to start a production assembly line, building as many as I can, trying to make them all consistent in size and shape, and then I'll be able to use and start gluing those together and figuring out my total sculpture form tomorrow.